Adventures Through the Mind is an interview-based podcast hosted by me, James W. Jesso. Here on the show, we take an interdisciplinary approach to the vast nuances and outer reaches of the psychedelic experience and of psychedelic culture. However, none of the explicitly drug-oriented content is meant to glorify or promote the use of drugs in any way. It is in the values of harm reduction that this show seeks to educate and explore the important insights related to psychedelic research while encouraging responsible, safe, and informed decisions. Also, this podcast is a part of a larger body of work that is my artistic and educational investment in being a writer and a speaker. It is fully fan-funded and would not be possible without listeners like you. So big thanks to those leaving one-time PayPal or crypto donations, as well as my patrons on Patreon for your generosity and support, especially those whose names are listed in the show notes to this episode. For those of you who have yet to become a supporter of the show, but are really liking it so far, I kindly invite you to offer whatever you can to the process of creating it by becoming my patron on Patreon or by leaving a one-time donation. Details can be found in the written description to this episode or at jameswjesso.com/support. Thank you. Enjoy the show. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Jesso. What you just heard before the intro music is the first time I will be using a consistent template to open the show. This is in an effort to reduce the intro times by getting all the sort of housekeeping points expressed in a very limited amount of time, because I often have a tendency to not be able to use my language with brevity unless I pre-plan, which I don't really like. I like being a little bit more intuitive, just coming in exactly how I am, having an idea of what I'm going to speak about, and then going off, but it just creates these really long intros, which you, the listeners, have said you'd like me to shorten, so here we go. I also won't be reading the reviews before the show anymore either to cut down on time. Instead, I will be posting reviews on my Twitter page, so you can follow me to see your review posted at James W. Jesso, which is also my handle on Instagram and Facebook. In favor of short intros, I will not be saying much more from here. The guest for this episode, Dmt McKenna, really doesn't need much of an introduction anyways to anyone who is participating or living in the psychedelic culture. And we actually did this interview in two parts. So there's a brief intermission, I mean like a 1-second intermission that sort of separates the two parts, just so that you're aware. It seems really disjointed. It's like, whoa, we just switched topics so randomly. Like, no, there was like 5 hours in between. We just started on a new topic. So that's it. Enjoy this episode with Dmt McKenna. Jon McKenna is an American ethnopharmacologist, research pharmacognosist. Was that right, Dennis?
Pharmacognosist.
Pharmacognosist, thank you. Lecturer and author. He is the brother of well-known psychedelic proponent, the Bard, Terence McKenna, and is a founding board member and the director of ethnopharmacology at the Heffter Research Institute, a nonprofit organization concerned with the investigation of the potential therapeutic uses of psychedelic medicines. McKenna received his master's degree in botany at the University of Hawaii in 1979. He received his doctorate in botanical sciences in 1984 from the University of British Columbia, where he wrote a dissertation entitled Monoamine Oxidase Inhibitors in Amazonian Hallucinogenic Plants, Ethnobotanical, Phytochemical, and Pharmacological Investigations. McKenna then received postdoctoral research fellowships in the Laboratory of Clinical Pharmacology, National Institute of Mental Health, and in the Department of Neurology, Stanford University School of Medicine. He is one of the founding contributors to the modern wave of ayahuasca research in particular, and psychedelic research in general. In fact, the book Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, which he co-authored with his brother Terence in the 70s, presented the first reliable method for cultivating psilocybin mushrooms at home. Chances are, you listening there, if it wasn't for Dennis and his brother, most of us would never have tasted the magic at all. Welcome to the show, Dennis.
Well, thank you so much, James. It's a pleasure to be here. Um, yeah, I can't take total credit for bringing mushrooms to the world. I wish I could, but I think if we hadn't done it, somebody else would have done it. We just got there a little earlier, and there were people, and we developed an relatively easy way to do it. So that's what made the difference. But thank you for the credit. I appreciate that.
Well, you heard the call and you took it before anyone else did. So despite what could have happened, I appreciate the place that you are playing in history, Dennis.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. We didn't really start out to, our motivation for trying to grow the mushrooms was really to be able to share the experience with a wider group, because the events that overtook us or transpired at La Chirera were so bizarre and just hard to integrate into any, reasonable model of reality. So we wanted confirmation. We wanted people who were not connected to us and our peculiar concerns to be able to access this experience and either confirm or not that there was this dimension out there that we had been exploring. And of course, they confirmed that, yep, it gets pretty strange out there, north of 5 grams.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it was validation. It was like, okay, we're not crazy. All this stuff people can experience, and you don't have to be Terence or Dennis, you don't have to be immersed in Jungian psychology or science fiction. I mean, it may help, but the dimension, the territory is kind of the same. So, developing that method and getting that out in the form of that little pamphlet, I regard in some way as our greatest accomplishment, even though we had to do it under pseudonyms. That probably wasn't really necessary, but we were paranoid in the day. But that really had an impact in the sense that brought a good, strong, non-toxic psychedelic into the hands of, just about any nerdy 10th grader with a patient to play around with it in his parents' basement. And a lot of people were in that position. I mean, it was like a science fair project in some ways, but it really changed the world, and in a good way, I think. It's always had unintended consequences, but in this case, well, Terence said something that was interesting. He said lots of interesting things, but with reference to this, he said something very funny, which is that we are involved in a symbiosis with something that has disguised itself as an alien invasion so as not to alarm us. Essentially, that's true. I mean, the invasion took place, and it was very quiet, and it really did sort of spread through the basements and the back rooms and the sheds of the nation, where people were finding, we can grow these things. And then, there's always the mercenary aspects, which we were happy about too, but that wasn't really our main motive to produce and sell mushrooms, although we did plenty of that back in the day. But it was really to give people access to the experience and then seek some consensus about it. And so in that sense, it had a good effect, and I'm happy to see that kind of continues. There is now a couple of different groups working with the idea of the extended DMT journey. I don't know if you've heard of any of that, but
I have. I actually just interviewed Rick Strassman a couple of days ago.
Well, there you go. Right. And that's interesting. I mean, I don't know if you can do that safely, but I imagine, it's worth looking at. It's worth looking into. There may be, psychonauts that are up to the task, but I'd be interested to see, how that works in a sense.
Yeah, actually, I really appreciated Rick's commentary on his recent commentaries in his blogs, the mainstreaming psychedelics, and his sort of thoughts around the process, and in talking about it being a problem that we might focus too deeply on the biomedical model and not give science the space and the credence to explore the profound phenomenology of the experience beyond the so-called therapeutic dose and into the actually high dose and very high dose regions.
No, I think that there is a, scientists are by nature cautious, right? And I think there is a certain fear of overselling it or over promoting it in some ways, and so to stick to the biomedical approach is the safe approach, because people can relate to that, and people that would normally not really listen to you, listen to that, because they say, you can say, well, these things actually have medical applications. They can help heal people, and they're not dangerous. They can be used safely. That people are much more receptive to that message than they are to the message of, north of 7 grams or whatever, you can talk to the aliens from Betelgeuse. That may well be true, but that's going to get you marked as a nutball, right? And then people they'll stop listening at that point. So, I think that I think it's great that psychedelics have these biomedical applications, and I certainly want to encourage that, and I think that will continue. But in some ways, the the real mystery of it is the phenomenology, and so you can go beyond just therapeutic application. I think these things are really, they're tools for exploring consciousness, both internally and externally. Externally they are lenses in a way for looking at the world in a different way, and internally we've never had anything like this to look into the unconscious or to examine consciousness. I mean, it's a cliche, but I think it's true that I think Stan Grof is known for saying that the psychedelics are, to the study of the mind what the microscope is to the study of biology. And I think it's just as fundamental. What we have to do is learn how to use these tools, and that's I think that's the stage we're in now. When psychedelics first emerged into cultural consciousness, which began sometime in the late 50s, and probably the publication of R. Gordon Wasson's article about mushrooms in Life magazine in 1957. I think that was a trigger, but then it sort of brought it into mass awareness in a certain way. I mean, who didn't have a copy of Life magazine on the coffee table if you grew up in the 60s? Everybody did. I know we did. And, we did not overlook this article. In fact, quite the opposite. It got us very excited. But then psychedelics sort of came in the 60s, and we didn't really know what to do with them as a culture. We didn't really appreciate that there were indigenous traditions going back thousands of years. So when LSD came into our culture, there was no context for it. I mean, it sort of dropped like a bomb. Everybody was excited or worried about it in different ways. The people that are receptive to the idea of consciousness expansion and, transformative technologies like that were very excited. And the people that ran things, or of course thought they ran things, were alarmed, because it was a catalyst for social change and for rethinking a lot of fundamental things that had happened in the 60s, in an era, where everything was being questioned. So it was regarded as very dangerous, and it was, in fact, dangerous. Not because the drug was dangerous, but because it made people have dangerous ideas. And those are always, seen as a threat by the reigning hegemonies of power, So it was dangerous in that sense. It made people question fundamental assumptions about society and about how people should be, and that were just accepted, and it overturned all that. So of course it had to be suppressed, but of course it couldn't be suppressed because nothing like that never works, right? Look at the previous history of mushrooms in the New World. The Spanish came, they did their very best to stamp out these blasphemous mushroom cults that talked about the flesh of the gods. I mean, this just got them completely apeshit because, comparing these filthy mushrooms to their sacrament, the Eucharist, the body of Christ, of course that's not what it did, but right. They interpreted it that way. So their attempts to suppress it were particularly brutal and completely ineffective. Because Wasson could come back 400 years later and rediscover it. And it never really went away. It just went underground.
Mm-hmm. And to some degree, people still can go down to Central America. Like I just recently went down and sampled the landside mushrooms of San Jose del Pacifico. So even still, it continues.
Yeah, you can still do it. And now it's not such a big deal. We have Ayahuasca Tourism, which is, a many-sided thing, good and bad aspects about it. But, in the 60s, when people started going to Mexico to take mushrooms, this was like, it was regarded as a scandalous thing. And naturally, people are going to do this. And now it's really not. I don't think people see it as particularly controversial, but what happened to, what happened in the 60s, or in a sense, what happened in Central America and South America 400 years ago kind of happened. There's a parallel to what happened in the latter part of the 20th century, because by, the end of the 60s, most of these things had been banned, and all the research shut down and so on. None of this went away, but it took another, roughly 20 to 30 years for that to open up again. And now it has, and we've learned a lot in the meantime. We've actually learned, I think, we in the psychedelic community have been forced to educate ourselves about the right ways to use these things, or the most productive ways to use them. And so that's happening. I think, the scientific biomedical studies are what you read about, and that gets a lot of the attention, but there's a lot more than that going on. There are just people working with it in many different ways, and sort of making it up as they go along in a certain way, but also borrowing from what we already know, either traditional knowledge or psychotherapy or a combination of these things. So, there's reason for optimism to see that these things are being used in this way and in, pretty intelligent ways, actually. So that's good.
Dennis, this brings up this next question that I have, which is kind of zooming in on basically why psychedelics, but zooming in specifically for yourself. Why did you choose to align your life path so deeply with psychedelics and their progression into the modern world, which I guess is a question to say, like, for you personally, why do psychedelics matter?
Well, of course, I have to credit Terence or blame Terence with a lot of this because he was 4 years older than me, and being a little brother who had a very exciting older brother who was always into interesting things, whatever they might be. Naturally, I wanted to tag along. It wasn't entirely like that, but I think for both Terence and myself, I think what led me into it, what led us into it, is that for various reasons, we grew up. We were interested in bizarre things and the esoteric or mind-bending concepts, and I attribute most of that to a lifelong interest in science fiction, and that was a big influence. And you would think the spiritual texts or the philosophy and all that, yes, that too, but it was really science fiction that got us preoccupied with the strange and the peculiar. And when psychedelics came along in the mid-'60s, was about the time we were finding out about it, it seemed like, very appealing to people like us who were thinking about extra-dimensional travel and hyperspace and time travel and, all these sort of other dimensions that are a part of the mythology of science fiction. And then along comes something which, what do you know, it might actually open up portals to these places, or it might be a way to penetrate into these places, and so that was very exciting to us, and it was just, psychedelics were simply the most interesting thing that was going on in our lives, and so that's why we got into it. We were fascinated by it, and we wanted to explore it as far as we could. So nothing else really seemed to have the appeal to us in terms of what we might do for a career or what. I mean, we didn't think of it in those terms, really. We didn't think about it, we didn't think that, if I dedicate my life to the study of psychedelics, I'll become famous or well known, or the opposite of it. If I dedicate my life to the study of psychedelics, it'll be the biggest mistake I ever made, and I never get anywhere. It might be closer. That might be closer to the reality, but in those days, in the 60s, we were both young. We weren't thinking in those terms. We were thinking DMT especially. DMT was the most amazing thing that we'd encounter in our young lives, and not just the most amazing drugs. We hadn't taken that many drugs, but simply the most amazing phenomenon that we'd encountered. And so we pretty much agreed that this is important, that this is what we need to look into. And so that's what led us down the primrose path that I guess we're still traveling in a certain way. Never really got off it. Didn't, so that's what led us into it. Simply, it was the most interesting thing that surfaced, in being a, bored teenager stuck in a small town in Colorado. I was very much into anything that might be a distraction, So that's what led us into it.
So what was it? Was it these precocious tendencies and this sense of curiosity that led you to following that interest all the way into your academic career?
Yeah, basically, yes. We originally didn't think of it as an academic endeavor. We were fascinated by DMT, and we thought that of all the psychedelics we had encountered, there weren't that many, but DMT was one of them. Back in the 60s, it was not easy to get. But we did get it, and we had those experiences, and we thought that we needed to pursue that. And so that's what led us to go to Colombia. It was a fairly down-to-earth goal, was to find some form of DMT that lasted longer than it did when we smoked it. Because when you smoke it, as you know, it's very short. And you come back with a sense of astonishment, but you can't bring back a lot of content, and so we thought if we could spend more time in that place, we might get more solid information, be able to bring back more insights in a sense. And so that's what led us to go to La Chorrera in search of this obscure Witoto drug, this supposedly orally active form of DMT made from Varola, which is one of the trees that is used to make snuff. And the sap of those trees is very high in tryptamine. But there was one tribe that we learned about that made an orally active preparation. And this all sort of took place before we really understood the pharmacology of ayahuasca, and that ayahuasca is an orally active form of DMT. The Varola preparation, when we finally got it, was not that exciting. But when we got to La Chorrera, this where we had been led in quest of this other thing, when we finally got there, there were psilocybin mushrooms everywhere. And, those are really the perfect orally active form of DMT. If you think about it, we didn't think of it in that way, but that we got into it. So anyway, that's how we, what got us into it was that. And then we had those experiences, which have been recounted in my brother's book, True Hallucinations, or in my book, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, about our adventures or misadventures down there.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and when it was over, when we came back, I think there was a divergence between Terence and me in the way that we understood this on the other side of this adventure. He became very committed to a lot of the ideas, like the time wave, that he became famous for in the decades that follow. I became almost like a reductionist, the experience was so impactful for me that in some ways I wanted to step back from it and just get down to earth again. And I sort of retreated into science, but I used that as a refuge to grounded in the real world. That's why I went back 10 years later and did basically ethnobotany, a fairly down-to-earth kind of thing. And that was a validation for me. But in some ways, it was a it was a distancing from the actual phenomena, and so I could be the objective scientist studying this thing from, as it were, a safe distance, of course I continued to take psychedelics, so it didn't totally work, but my science was, like working with a piece of radioactive material behind a lead screen or something. You could keep a certain distance from it as long as you were, doing chemistry, grinding up plants, giving it to rats, whatever, it's got that nice, safe character about it.
Mm-hmm. So even with this intellectual distance that you were taking, there certainly wasn't a physical distance. Like, you went back to the Amazon. In fact, you were, although among the first, you were also amongst the last people who journeyed into the Amazon with the intentions around ayahuasca before the big ayahuasca boom. And I'm curious if you could tell us what it was like for you as a young researcher to be going into these mostly unknown realms of the jungle to find and experience ayahuasca before it was institutionalized for drug tourism, and how you would differ those experiences than what one might find today when they go down looking for ayahuasca.
Right. Well, yeah, that's a complicated question, and there are many, many answers to that. But yeah, the ayahuasca tourism phenomenon, when I went there looking for ayahuasca and determining to do my thesis work primarily on ayahuasca. Actually, my thesis was a comparison between this Witoto, orally active tryptamine, which was called ukuhe, and ayahuasca. But at the end of the day, I spent more time investigating ayahuasca, and the other thing turned out to be more of a curiosity, not something I would pursue, really pursued for many years as I have ayahuasca. But sorry, I lost the thread.
It's okay.
Sorry. What were we talking?
It's okay. I was asking about your early experiences going down as a young researcher into the jungle, and then comparing that to what we'd find today.
Well, the cultural context was obviously different, and ayahuasca tourism has changed the tradition. It's changed the content of the tradition. It's changed almost everything about it. Not that it was, the people I was dealing with when I was doing my field work, these were not really off in the jungle, uncontacted tribes or anything like that. I mean, I'm not that much of an Indiana Jones, but ayahuasca, as a part of ethnomedicine, and the tradition is called vegetalismo, is part of mestizo life in Peru, and those were the people that I was mostly dealing with. They weren't. A few lived separately from their communities, but most people were part of their communities, and they were, for most ayahuasqueros at that time, they were somebody in the community who knew this skill, who used ayahuasca for healing, and mostly his clientele was local and very informal and very humble. People would come to the Maloca, the hut where my first informant, Don Fidel, lived. It was his home, and 2 or 3 nights a week there would be 10 or 12 people would show up and drink ayahuasca, and it's very informal. Usually there's a reason for it. It was usually that there was at least one person in the group who came for some specific treatment, and he would give them to them, not necessarily psychological, all kinds of conditions. People would show up with, problems, diabetic neuropathies, all kinds of conditions. Whether he was able to treat them effectively, it's not clear, but that's the way it was, and there was no real extra-cultural aspect to it. And then, that was 1981. Well, by 1991, or the middle of the 90s, this ayahuasca tourism phenomenon was beginning to take off, and I think one of the catalysts for that had to be Luis Eduardo Luna, who is an anthropologist and who was studying in the same area when I was, and actually is a very good friend of mine, both me and Terence. But I introduced him to, in fact, Pablo Amaringo, who was the visionary painter who painted all these ayahuasca paintings. He and Eduardo published a book called Ayahuasca Visions in about 1992. And it was a, reproduction of all his visionary paintings on one page and Eduardo's explanations in English on the other page of what these things meant. And then that came out as a coffee table, beautiful book published by North Atlantic Press initially, I think, in 1992. This really, I think, was a catalyst, just like the Life magazine article in 57 with Wasson. I think this book was a catalyst in that it got the idea of ayahuasca in front of people, and they could see this book and look at these beautiful pictures and say, wow, I want to do that, and there's a certain romance to the idea of going down and looking for a shaman. It's the whole teachings of Don Juan mythology that has been inculcated into our culture. And that was really, I think, the start of it. There were just a few people coming to look for ayahuasca before that. After that, it began to be a trickle, and then eventually a flood. And now we have the situation that we have in Iquitos and other places, primarily Iquitos. That seems to be the epicenter for this phenomenon, and it's the Wild West, and I don't know what to make of it. I think that you cannot control it, really. I think that's the last thing we want to do, but there are problems that come up when any sort of globally dominant culture comes in contact with a very fragile tradition. And when you bring economics into it, I mean, ayahuasqueros, formerly, they were just people who lived in their communities, and they were like folk doctors, but they were farmers, they were fishermen, they had day jobs, that wasn't their living. That was something that they did probably out of a spiritual calling or just compassion to want to help people. But now, these indigenous ayahuasqueros have become kind of superstars. And because the gringos are coming with all this money, they can make more money in a night than they might make in, half a year before. So it skewed the economic situation a lot. And there are a lot of things about it that are not so positive, but many things that are. And I think it's like, it's like any spiritual tradition. You're talking about something that is numinous, something that has essentially a spiritual impact on people. And anytime you get that within a context of a group activities, there's going to be somebody somewhere that will see that as a vehicle to power and riches and whatever it is they long for. So, ayahuasca spirituality is as much, it's in danger of becoming cult-like, I guess, is one way to say it, as much as any other spiritual tradition, which I think is too bad. Because I think a lot of what ayahuasca teaches you is think for yourself. Don't accept what you're told is the truth. Don't accept what you're told to believe. That's one of the beautiful things about psychedelics. You can essentially, you don't have to have any faith. You can verify it for yourself and draw your own conclusions about what it's about. So, but it is spiritually impactful, so there are people that can misuse it, I think. And this is going on, and it's not the fault of ayahuasca. It's the fault of being human. And this is how, this is the way we are. You can't really name a spiritual tradition that can't be screwed up by somebody, and I think that's kind of what we're seeing now. But, when I back away and look at it from a deeper perspective, and being a a biologist and a person interested in, plant chemistry and all that, when I look at it from a higher perspective, I think that what's really going on here is a kind of coevolution, and the ayahuasca and other sacred plants are suddenly, at this time of cultural crisis, they're emerging almost as ambassadors for the community of species and trying to get we monkeys to wake up and realize the impact we're having on the planet, on the environment. So many people come away with that revelation after they take ayahuasca, and these others too, but ayahuasca seems to deliver the message. So in that sense, this is a good thing. If you look at it as part of coevolution, then you have to remember the time frame of all this is exceedingly short. Western science has only known about ayahuasca since the 1850s. So in the terms of evolutionary time, that's a very short period of time. And the ayahuasca phenomenon, maybe it's 20 years, maybe 25 years, not very long, so it's premature to draw conclusions. I think we don't really know how this is going to turn out. On balance, I think it's mostly positive, because I think that, and this is true of ayahuasca and other psychedelics, I think as we learn how to use these therapeutically and otherwise, ceremonially, as we learn how to use them, ultimately they can be implemented in a beneficial way. I mean, they are a stimulus to wake up to the planet, wake up to ourselves. I think the beneficial effects of it, are manifested in a number of ways. I think heightened environmental consciousness, which is important. And I think also, perhaps more enlightened ways of relating to each other, and a little more compassion, a little more respect. And I think we need that. Those two things really need to push back against what seem to be the dominating trends, in our society. Lack of compassion, lack of respect, and, really unfortunately, since the last administration, but it's been a trend. There are a lot of very hateful and hurtful things going on, and it doesn't need to be that way. We need to learn, how to be kind to each other, how to be kind to the planet, and how to be kind to ourselves ultimately.
This comes up.
Those are what it can teach. I'm sorry, I'm going on and on and on.
Oh, it's okay.
That's what it can teach you.
So three things kind of came up in that I feel would be great to expand on, Dennis. With your one of which is a sense of what I might be misperceiving as you expressing an inherent benevolence to the psychedelic experience. The other of which is about plant intelligence, and the other which is about spirituality. And I want to ask you those three, but maybe just starting first off with, and I'll ask them sequentially. Do you see that the psychedelics, maybe ayahuasca in particular, or psychedelics in general, do you see them as having an inherently benevolent force?
Not really. I think that, and I've talked about this a lot in lectures, I think psychedelics are a tool. I think they're a technology. I think that they can be used for good or ill like any technology. And I think that the moral dimension in the way that we choose to utilize any technology comes from within. The moral dimension is within the human heart, and it's in the way that we choose to behave. You can use, this has always been the argument against, in the argument for and against drugs in general, that it's always been skewed. The discussion has been skewed as though the drugs themselves are seen as inherently evil. They're regarded as demons or pathogens, and we have, we can talk about, cocaine has destroyed the inner city. No, I'm sorry, cocaine just has the property it has. There are all sorts of beneficial ways to use drugs, and there are all sorts of harmful ways to use drugs. It's the decisions made by people that determine whether that's good or bad. It's important to remember, because it's very easy to lose sight of that. These discussions become very distorted if you don't keep that in mind. I don't think any of these things, they're simply chemicals and plants. They have the properties they do. It's how we choose to use those things. And that's where the moral dimension comes from.
So this goes into the next question about coevolution and ambassadorship. And ambassadorship for me comes, I hear that and I get the sense of a personification in some way. So where does the idea with something like coevolution and ambassadorship, there's this underlying perception or implied intelligence in the plants that might be contained in the experience itself. So the question is kind of twofold, which is like, are you suggesting that these plants are intelligent? And if so, what does that intelligence look like? And then the other part of that question is sort of how does that inherent intelligence then come into play when we're discussing psychedelics as tools with no with their goodness or badness determined by how we as humanity relate to them?
Right. Well, I do think that plant intelligence is a real thing. A few years ago, to even discuss this was considered, pretty woo-woo, pretty out there, but there is increasingly accumulating. It's almost becoming respectable. There's evidence accumulating that plants are intelligent, but not in the way that we are, obviously. And you have to think about what is intelligence. And one way to define intelligence is if something can interact with its environment in such a way that it optimizes its situation, that it seeks the optimal way to relate to its environment that benefits it and whatever may interact with it most, then that's a kind of intelligence. It implies planning, it implies a strategy, it implies memory. And all of these things do go on with plants and are now beginning to be studied. Plants don't have brains, but in the way that we do, but brains are overrated. It turns out that you can have intelligence without brains, and highly connected networks, like so-called neural networks, but they're not necessarily neural, but highly connected networks like mycelial networks, or the networks that exist in ecosystems, between the roots of trees and the mycelium in the ground are these huge symbiotic networks. And it turns out they're like the internet of the forest. These are pathways for information exchange. And equilibrium and the health of the forest is maintained through these communication channels. And the other things plants can do is they're great chemists, and so they generate all of these so-called secondary compounds, which are not required for life because they don't occur in all organisms, but they're certainly doing something. And it appears that what they're doing is they are communication. They're a means of communication. Plants talk chemistry is a simple way to put it. They use their chemical facility to create these messenger molecules that can relate. That's how they mediate their relations with everything in their environment is through chemistry. It's like a famous botanist once said, plants substitute biosynthesis for behavior. We respond to the environment through behavior, fight or flight, stay or go. And we can move around. Plants can't do that. So they have to develop methods for dealing with whatever's around them because they can't run away from it. And they use chemistry very often. And sometimes the message is stay away. They put out a toxin, or they send definitely a message that just don't muck with me. I don't want to be eaten. I don't want to be bothered. More often, and it gets more interesting when they put out a chemical message that says, how about we symbiose? Come hither. Let's do stuff together. And in plants, this chemical process has been studied mostly in terms of insects, and complex relations that insects have to flowering plants it's all chemically mediated, right? And the plant is producing molecules that target the nervous systems of the insects in a certain way and influence their behavior. But it doesn't stop there. We're omnivorous animals. We eat a lot of different plants, and some of the compounds in those plants happen to resemble the neurotransmitters in our brain. In some cases, they're identical to the neurotransmitters in our brain. So this is a reflection of evolutionary history. These small molecules, neurotransmitter-like molecules, have over time, originally they served a signaling function in the ecosystem. And they still do, and they were like exohormones. But then as mammals evolved and nervous systems became more complex, and actually it goes way earlier than the mammals, but these compounds became internalized for signaling functions. So what we call neurotransmitter, they exist in the brain. Chances are they had external signaling functions millions, if not hundreds of millions of years before that. So for whatever reason, we have evolved with these plant chemicals. I mean, I think it's interesting, for example, the biogenic amines, which are a set of compounds that include most of the neurotransmitters we know that mediate consciousness. So dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine are kind of the class of biogenic amine neurotransmitters. It's interesting that these all come from aromatic amino acids. They're essentially decarboxylation products of those compounds. And we don't make those compounds. We have to get those from plants. So, and that's why they're called essential, because they're essential for the diet. We have to get them from dietary sources. I think it's interesting that we have to take in these plant chemicals and convert them into neurotransmitters in order to be conscious. So, we have this close symbiotic association. And whether it's an accident of evolution or there's more going on, it just so happens that some of these plant psychedelics fit into the same receptors that mediate these conscious processes. And particularly when you're targeting serotonin, then that crosses over. I don't know why it is that there should be, populations of receptors in the brain that when you stimulate it with the right agonist, 5-HT2A agonist, you get a mystical experience. But you can reliably do that with these compounds. What is the evolutionary advantage of that? It's hard for me to say. I don't know, but it evolved that way. So there must be something to it. And if I had to speculate, I think that in a sense there is a part of the neocortex, primarily the newer part of our brain, this expanded frontal part of our brain, where there are these complexes of neurons and receptors, and if you tweak them the right way with the right psychedelic, essentially, they will open the window to an unseen world that you may never have suspected before, or only encountered in dreams, perhaps. So you can manifest that world, and as a thinking, big-brained primate with a lot of time on their hands and way too much curiosity, you got to think that that's going to have an impact on the way they view the world, and that is the origin of, religion, science, everything else. I think the sort of the metaphysical aspects of human consciousness were probably triggered by these experiences.
So then, where does this where does that fall into your thoughts on psychedelics being, good or bad only by determination of how we relate to them?
Well, yeah, it depends on what we do with the message that we get from them. I don't think that, it's hard to sort of discuss these things because it's so the temptation to anthropomorphize everything and to think, well, this comes from Gaia. This is a message from Gaia, and Gaia, the very fact that we can think of it as Gaia usefully is an indication of how much we want to humanize the motivations and the way that these biological systems work. And we have to be careful of that. We have to be clear that we're employing these metaphors, but that's what they are. They're metaphors. That said, however, I think it's reasonable to think that the community of species on the planet, they do work together, and they work, cooperation in ecosystems is far more important than competition. Evolution used to be all about survival of the fittest, competition, nature red in tooth and claw, and all this. That was the earlier model. But I think that's really not as important as symbiosis. Communities of species do better when things cooperate and they work together. And we're now, as we look more deeply into coevolution, this becomes clear. It's not like Gaia, thinks to herself and says, well, I better send out a message to these primates because they're making a mess of things. And if I send this message, maybe some of them will wake up. I mean, that's an anthropomorphization of how it reacts. And I don't think it reacts. I think it reacts in an intelligent way, but not quite in this very human way that we might attribute to it. It reacts to it in the same way that these chemically linked signaling networks might react to any threat. An old growth forest that is regulated through these networks. If there's a fire on the edge of the forest, or if a pathogen starts to penetrate into the forest, there are chemical networks, chemical signals that go back through the entire network, and it responds to that, either by making compounds to, ward off the pathogen or whatever. It responds to it. But it's almost like a built-in reaction. I don't know to what degree you could say that's conscious. It's just the way it's put together to optimize its survival. And so then you have these monkeys, who are crawling all over everything and screwing it up. The biosphere reacts to that no differently than it might to a pathogen or a virus or an infective insect or invasive insect. It's the same kind of challenge.
Like again, the slippery language of anthropomorphizing things, but it's almost like we're in a process now with the diseases of civilization, and also the emergence of sort of interest in the psychedelic realms, that it's like the planet is doing whatever it can to either kill us off or get us back on its side.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's exactly what's happening. And, indigenous people have always said, they've always regarded these plants as plant teachers. I mean, that's a concept you find all over the world. These sacred plants, these psychoactive plants are teachers, and so what's the lesson? What are they trying to teach us if they're teachers? Well, in part, I think the big lesson, especially for our times, is to try and teach us to wake up and realize that we're part of nature. We don't own it, and we're not separate from it. And I think that's a big lesson, because we have 2,000 years and more of Judeo-Christian culture, which has poisoned the Western mind, at least, by propagating this idea that nature has no value. We should not cling to things of this world. We should look for our reward in heaven, which is an excuse to devastate and despoil everything on earth. And so this is a very toxic mindset and a very dangerous mindset. And this is why, we have to undergo globally a change in perspective. We have to realize that we're part of this symbiosis, not the owners of nature, not the controllers. We're part of the symbiosis. And, so we need to become humble, We need to realize we're not running things. The plants are running things. And we should be grateful for that, because the plants are what's keeping oxygen and carbon dioxide balances in the atmosphere, maintaining planetary temperatures, all of these homeostatic processes that the ecosystem as a whole, the biosphere, employs in order to keep itself in a steady state. And then we come along, and because we're thoughtless, and because we're dangerous in some ways, and because we've bought into this idea that nature exists for us to exploit, we're a threat to this stability, and we're busily. These homeostatic systems are quite stable and they're quite resilient, but there are limits, and we're approaching those limits. We're working furiously to destabilize all of these things to a point where they can't recover. And I think that's one reason these psychedelic plants have become sort of so visible on the global stage. The biosphere recognizes that we're in a crisis, and it's sort of, they're getting a little hysterical, trying to get our attention. Hey, you monkeys, wake up! We need to have a talk here about what you're doing. And so I think that's what's going on. That's part of this coevolution. The question is, will enough people get the message in time, and then wake up in time so that we can slow this down?
Or if there is still time,
is still time.
Yeah.
And there's less and less all the time. I mean, I'm basically an optimist. I think that people, are very ingenious, and I think that, if I gave up completely, I don't know, I wouldn't even get out of bed in the morning. I'd be so depressed. So optimism is sort of a way of being. But you have to be realistic, too. I mean, we are in a heap of shit. There's no doubt. And we have, the first step, if you're digging a hole, is to stop digging. And that's really what we need to do as a species. We have to understand that there are ways to form a true symbiosis with the community of species and the community of each other that does nurture the planet. We do not have to deplete the planet. There are ways to do this, but it's discouraging when you see, governments and, for example, the United States, very regressive now environmental policies.
Well, regressive feels like it's accurate, but it almost feels like an understatement to how damaging what it is what this current administration's doing.
Yeah, they're doing as much damage as they can, but remember, it only lasts for a few years, and the systems are resilient. And even, like, people are contrary anyway. They're contrarian, so it's good. There's a lot of resistance to this nonsense. And, these people, they do not know what they're doing, and they don't really think in terms of the consequences. I mean, unfortunately, the people that, one feels could benefit most from a big glass or two of ayahuasca will probably never take it. So, and I'm not even sure they could appreciate it if they did. There has to be an inner self in order to benefit from something like ayahuasca. But
it reminds me of something your brother said, something along the lines of that these things are consciousness expanders, but you need to have consciousness to expand it.
Yeah, you need to have a consciousness to expand it. And that's what's so dismaying, I think, about Donald Trump, because you can listen to him. It doesn't take very long to realize this man has never had a self-reflective moment in his entire life, and that is very worrisome. It's all external. It's all flash. It's all, he really is the director of The Apprentice, of this reality show, and there's nothing beyond that. There is no inner self, as far as anyone can tell. I could be wrong, but I do not think Donald Trump is a very introspective person. There's nothing to introspect about.
Right. Possibly, depending on different sort of, say analyses, there's probably a deep and profound inner self there, but it's difficult to get to because, like, through the manner in which he was raised, came from so many generations of just like deep trauma in some way or another that the personality is so strong that he can't see beyond it, the defense patterns, and the pain's so great that why would he ever look? And the truth of what's actually going on is always buried deep inside of authenticity, which is often even deeper inside of piles and piles of intergenerational pain. So, and definitely looking at Donald Trump, he doesn't seem like the kind of guy to want to muster up to that kind of challenge, which reminds me of my next question, which I want to move on to, because all this talk about, like, you had used the term enlighten, to enlighten us, and terms like waking up and reconnecting, with the planet, with the intelligence of the planet. All of this gives suggestions towards psychedelics as agents for spiritual development. And yet there's a common theme, common criticism to this, which is changing, and definitely inside of the context in which you've been speaking about them. It seems pretty clear that they can work in this way, but the argument about it is to say that utilizing psychedelics to achieve some sort of state of awareness, some spiritual state of awareness, or some sort of spiritual healing or personal growth is like cheating or inauthentic simply because they are psychoactive. What are your thoughts on that argument?
I totally disagree with it. I think that people assume, so what it boils down to is you're saying, or these people say, well, you can take a psychedelic and have a mystical experience, but it's not real. Mm-hmm. Because you had to take a substance to achieve that. Well, I'm here to tell you that every experience that you have is mediated by your neurochemistry. We live in a hallucination. We're high on drugs right now. They just happen to be the drugs that are the hormones, the neurotransmitters, the other signaling molecules that make our brains work. Those are drugs. And we are in an artificial reality. That's what the brain does. It takes information from the outside. A lot of what it does is filter very selectively what gets in from the outside. It puts it together with, through associative processes, other things, memories, things like that. And it basically generates a more or less coherent fairy tale or movie or hallucination, if you want to call it that, of reality. And that's the hallucination we inhabit. So, we're not in the real world. The real world, we live in a model of the real world. Our brains are pretty good at synthesizing a model of the real world. But we're not in that real world. That is inherently unknowable, and we have instruments that can probe in and tell us, what you think is the real world doesn't look anything like what you're experiencing. And then, of course, there's a conundrum because we have to obey our instruments. So I completely dismiss that argument. There is no such to say, any experience that you have is an experience, whether chemically induced or induced by your own neurochemistry, it's an experience. So that's the raw datum. That happened to you. That is happening. That is true in the sense that it's experienced. And whether it's objectively true or something you made up or a hallucination or a delusion, we can have those conversations. But what we ultimately have is the datum of experience, what's right in front of us right now. That's what we are experiencing. So to say that I took psilocybin and I had a profound insight about reality, about the nature of the self, about evolution, or our spiritual destiny, in no way is that less valid than looking at it. I mean, it just doesn't. It just doesn't fly to say it's not real. I mean, these statements are made by people who never really have thought about what is reality, and what is reality? Well, for one thing, it's this model of reality that we inhabit. This is not the real world. This is a model that has been constructed for our convenience and so that we don't go nuts, so that we can make sense of it to a certain extent.
Dennis, I reckon my listeners would probably disown me if I didn't ask you specifically about Terence. And in fact, I might very well disown myself. So
yeah.
You wrote a book not too long ago, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, that tells not only your own story that we sort of spoke on earlier, but the story of Terence as well from your vantage point, which is a window into this incredible man unlike anyone else in the world. He's been an inspiration for a lot of people, including myself, and has had a huge impact on what we know now as psychedelic culture. But although he may have attained legend status to a lot of us, you knew Terence the man, Terence, your older brother. What are some things about Terence that the average listener might not know about him, things that are reflective of who he was as a person and not just as a cultural phenomenon?
Well, that's difficult to answer. I think that his, I looked at the video that you sent me that James Kent made. I think there's some truth to what James was saying. I think that Terence was, it was kind of he wasn't really looking for celebrity, and he certainly didn't think of himself as a guru. I think that he was, misperceived by a lot of his fan base as somebody that was presenting themselves that way. And actually, in some ways, he was the anti-guru. I mean, his message, a lot of his message was think for yourself, But when but he liked to have fun with ideas, and he liked to entertain all these crazy ideas. And I don't know how serious he was about them, or whether that was like the time wave. I saw the time wave in his thinking, go through a number of different stages. I mean, at first, he was totally convinced that this was a valid theory and that it described time and that it was, some kind of breakthrough. And then I think by, over a period of years, he got criticism from that, from various quarters, one of which was me. I mean, I was always a bit skeptical about the time wave. Actually, I was more than a bit skeptical about it. I was quite skeptical about it. I just thought there were assumptions about it that were unexamined. But that said, I think it's an interesting thing. Do I believe it's a revolutionary theory about the structure of time? I don't. I think that, and that's very hard to defend, and I think Terence felt beleaguered in some ways about the time wave, and got a little defensive, but then later in life he began to wonder himself if this was really valid, if really it ought not be rethought in some ways. So he was uncertain, and he was, I mean, it's like for every guru, I could call him the reluctant guru, because for every, and I think this is true of any iconic figure, with the kind of charisma that he had and the ability to speak that he had, there's going to be a fan base, a fairly adoring fan base that is really not interested in, seeing their guru or, the person they look up to, interested in seeing them become challenged, and there is, I guess for every guru, there's 100 followers in a certain way. And that's part of the problem with these types of, whether spiritual institutions or whatever, that coalesce around a charismatic figure, when they may not really welcome that. And I don't really think Terence was looking for that. But I think that his circumstances, in a way, forced him into that role. And I think that was part of the conflicts that he had with himself later in life. He was being portrayed one way in the media and by his fans and by his public persona. At the same time, he was having a lot of personal doubts about himself, about whether that was really what he was about, what he wanted to be about. So he had a ambiguous relationship with his fan base. He's basically a fairly introverted person, but in order to make a living and also talk about these ideas he was passionate about, he had to get into the public arena. And I think it was uncomfortable for him many times. And that may be part of, what he was plagued with, in the latter part of his life. And James mentioned that he, at some point, stopped taking mushrooms.
That's something I wanted to ask you about, actually.
Yeah. Well, I think it's only partly true. I think what I do know is that there were some mushroom experiences he had in the late 90s, late 1980s or early 90s that were very impactful and quite challenging for him existentially. It's not just that they were bad trips. He's put up with lots of bad trips, but these were I don't know how to say it. They basically struck at the very sort of cognitive foundations of his thinking and his personality and his whole existential, persona in a certain way. And he found that very uncomfortable. And I think for him, I can't say this for sure, but I think that in part, the psychedelic experience was okay as long as it wasn't personal, and for many years it wasn't personal with him. when it became personal and the mirror, was turned back on the self, I think that he found that uncomfortable and maybe stepped back from it for some of those reasons. But I can't second guess him. I don't know. It is a good example of, it's I don't know what you would call it. You would call it this is the dark side of being a celebrity, even though he was a kind of, but you can sympathize. You can see what celebrities go through. Imagine, good thing we're not real celebrities,
Right.
we could go out on the street and not everybody is going to recognize us. In fact, very few people recognize me, and that I'm known, but I'm known in a certain community, and but if you're somebody like I don't know, Michael Jackson or somebody, some of these people, you can see how difficult it is to be like this mega well-known person. And I guess that was part of his his existential crisis, is that he was viewed one way by his public, and yet another. Internally, he didn't feel like he was that. And I don't know who of us does, but there was that cognitive, disjunct between the way the world perceived him and the way that he thought himself or knew himself to be. I think he was harder on himself than he needed to be, so it's a complex thing, and I don't really know that there is a single definitive answer. I mean, one goes through stages in life where if you stay the same way all of your life, then you're not getting very far. You're kind of not getting the lesson. And many of the ideas and so on that he was talking about were things that we stumbled on in our 20s. Well, when you're in your 50s or 40s, they look different from that angle. So I don't know. That's not a very good answer to your question.
No, that's an excellent answer. I found it increasingly more so as I go through my own process of engaging psychedelics. There's this realization that more is not necessarily better, and the deeper I've gone, the bigger they get, and the more there is for me to unpack, and the more often I go in, the more likely I am to just confuse myself. And I find it really interesting that people sort of like sneeringly say, well, look, Terence stopped, in a sense of like, oh, look how he failed us, or look how he lied to us. But it is very complicated. I mean, I think it's entirely reasonable to have a profound psychedelic experience and feel like it's not time to trip again for a long time. And in the context in which it's like socially that was around him, it's like people wanted him to be this person that maybe he wasn't. And I could see how that would be incredibly difficult on him. Yeah.
That's right. That produced a lot of cognitive dissonance. It's like there's this expectation in his public that he has to be some kind of psychedelic cowboy, and is always pushing the envelope. And actually, he wasn't for long periods. He never totally abandoned psychedelics, but he did cut way back in the 90s, and at the same time there he is out in public being the chief spokesman and advocate for psychedelics. And so that's a kind of an awkward place to be. I don't know, the fan base. And I think this is a dynamic that happens with celebrities in general. The fan base can be awfully cruel, and when you don't live up to their expectations, then they will pile on, and they'll say, well, you're a traitor, or you're a liar, or you misled us, and so on. and to a degree, maybe that's true. But then they need to, being psychedelic, you'd think they could have a little more compassion.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem with being a celebrity and being a fan who is looking at that celebrity and criticizing that person, the celebrity is like a two-dimensional figure, and it's possible to look at that two-dimensional figure, but it's like an iceberg. Most of it's under the surface, and you don't know what the dynamic was that led the person to have this public behavior or this, and these public expectations. And I think that is a stressful thing. It's like the public sees me one way. I'm not really that way. I don't want to be that way. But you're in the trap, because you've got a shtick, and the shtick is paying the bills.
Right.
And so you have to stick with it, no pun intended.
You intended that pun, Dennis. Come on.
I did intend it. But you can't step out of it. It's not so easy to step out of it.
Mm-hmm. That brings up a question. Sorry to interrupt here, but
no, that's okay.
The question might be a bit too personal, so I'd understand if you're not comfortable with it, but you knew Terence as your big brother. You knew him as this person who was first and foremost Terence, your brother, before he was Terence the Bard McKenna, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel now, after him now being dead, to see the way people prop him up? And even if James Kent's criticisms and observations were valid to some degree, what does it feel like when you see the Bard McKenna who has been propped up also getting torn down, with him not around to, ultimately defend himself?
Well, I don't know. It doesn't bother me much, actually, because I think a person's life is what it is, and he doesn't have to defend himself, he lived his life. People can make whatever judgment they want, because it makes no difference either way. He lived his life. He was a flawed person. Who of us isn't? He was also a brilliant man. I think, on balance, if you want to look at the contributions that Terence McKenna made to our culture and especially to psychedelic culture, on balance, I think you'd have to say it was a good thing.
I definitely agree.
He had a positive influence. He was not a guru. He was not a messiah. He wasn't even always a very, kind person, or, he's no saint, I guess. And there is this tendency to put people on pedestals. And I think he actually rejected that in the last part of his life. That's why he was uncomfortable, But the people that go around, you've probably heard of this guy, Jan Irvin, that's going around
saying he was a CIA informant.
He was a CIA. Other than the fact that the man is completely deluded, none of that is true. And if anybody looks at what he is saying, you can see that this is more about his paranoia than anything to do with truth.
Well, you might actually be an agent of the CIA, Dennis. Like, you might be employed to tell us that.
I might be, but I'm not. And the thing is, the point kind of that I want to make, he is always like, saying these things about me and saying these things about Esalen, about Terence and so on, and wants me to, come on his podcast or whatever to defend myself. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, what is there? I'm not on trial here. Why should I come on your fucking little podcast to defend myself? You're wasting my time. And I've told him many times, they can say whatever they want. I frankly don't give a shit. And
all right.
that's the best defense, because it's like my life is an open book. I mean, I don't, if I were a CIA agent, I'd a terrible CIA agent because I don't really have any secrets, and and my life speaks for itself, and I think people can make their own judgments. And, for this guy to root around in the, back in the 60s about what really happened at Esalen. And, I mean, sure, there was undoubtedly at the origins of the, in the psychedelic movements in the 60s, the CIA was involved because they were involved in everything. But that's far short of saying that they were organizing and creating the whole thing. No, they were as confused as anybody else, and nobody knew what to do with these things. So I sort of like, in other words, if I were to go on this gentleman's podcast and try to, knock down his arguments, which wouldn't be too hard, but just the act of doing it would be to validate it in a certain way. It would be a statement that, well, you're worth 30 minutes of my time.
And if he is delusional in this idea, then arguing with him wouldn't make a difference. Now, I haven't gone too deep into Jan Irvin's work. I explored it, didn't really connect with me, didn't really follow it much after that. But yeah, it seems like it would be kind of a waste of your time.
It would be a waste of my time. And it would not convince him because delusional people are not open to reason. And like I say, I mean, Terence and I were, I mean, I'm sorry, we were not CIA agents, or if we were, we didn't know it. So,
right. Sleeper agents, maybe.
Sleeper agents, but not, but that's the thing. There are always people that can, focus on the negative parts and draw conclusions that, he liked to use this a piece of software which showed connections, and he'd say, "Look at all these connections," and I'm like, "Well, in the course of human affairs, people make connections.
6 degrees of separation, yeah.
Yeah, a place like Esalen, all kinds of people went through Esalen over the years, and that doesn't make it a hotbed of CIA, intrigue. It just means that it was a place that attracted everybody from brilliant teachers to complete screwballs, and that's just the nature of the institution. There's nothing to be concluded from it other than people talk to each other, they make connections. So there's not necessarily a sinister thing.
So I have a couple questions. Not to derail the counter argument to your possible CIA involvement. But I have a couple questions from my patrons on Patreon. But before that, I want to ask: if what comes up for you right now when I ask you, what is your favorite story with Terence?
Well, it's hard to say. There are many stories. I don't know that there is a favorite one, really. It wouldn't be honest of me to say that. I mean, I can think of one, which actually is a third-party thing, but I think this is kind of reflective of what we've been talking about his existential crisis, or existential situation. And it's a time when he was at Esalen with Ram Dass. And Ram Dass was going on about him and about how, he was this cultural icon and how his life was his message, right? And this was a time of crisis in Terence's life. And he said, "No, my life is a mess. My message is my message," which I thought was pretty honest, actually, and kind of a pushback against Ram Dass's effort to, again, make him this iconic figure, this figure on a pedestal, which is nonetheless a two-dimensional figure. Mm-hmm. I mean, so there is that. I'd have to give it more thought to think about. I mean, there are so many things, but nothing specifically stands out as the thing.
Well, if at any point in the future, Dennis, you all of a sudden feel inspired to share a juicy story and a loving story of Terence, I would be happy to jump on a Skype call with you and record it. Let's get into these questions from my patrons. Podcast is funded, excuse me, on Patreon, which is sort of a community crowdfunding pledge sort of thing. And one of the things that people get by becoming a patron is the opportunity to ask questions to upcoming guests. So the first question is asking you to comment on the difference between microdosing LSD and psilocybin.
Okay, well, this is kind of a can of worms, actually. You can microdose. People are microdosing with these things, and you can microdose with LSD, with psilocybin. I have not done that, and I have some question as to whether there's much more to it than just a placebo effect. It may just be mostly a placebo effect. With psilocybin, the amounts that you would have to take to microdose, or I don't know what people take, a half a gram or so of dried mushrooms, it may have a slight effect. And I microdosed LSD for a while, and it seemed to have a very slight effect. I was thinking taking, I think, 5 micrograms every other day, and it had a little bit of a cognitive boost, in the morning, but the effect faded away. And then I increased that to like 10 micrograms every other day, and then it had an effect for a while, and then it faded away. And of course, we know these compounds are, they form tolerance very readily. But something has come up lately with microdosing of LSD that might be a concern, which is a lot of serotonergic agents that hit the 5-HT2B receptors. And LSD does that. Most of these things do to a degree. But mediated through that is a pathology which has to do with proliferation of tissue in the heart valves. So it's valvular hypertrophy or something like that. And there have been drugs that affect mainly serotonin that have been taken off the market. Things like fenfluramine was taken off the market in the late 90s because it caused this problem. And it's possible that LSD microdosing might put a person at risk for this. And the reason we're not sure why, but LSD, there's been interesting work that shows that LSD's binding to the receptor is different than all these other psychedelics. And that's one reason it's so much more potent than all these other psychedelics. There's been work done that shows that when the molecule complexes with the 2A receptor, or in this case, the 2B receptor, there is like a molecular flap. You can think of it, a molecular piece of the protein that folds over it, that makes it hard to dissociate. So it's trying to bounce out of the receptor, and it keeps getting pushed back into the receptor. So that prolongs the time it takes to dissociate, and prolongs the period that it's activating this receptor. This may be a problem, and this may be contributing to that, and it's certainly contributing to one reason why LSD is much more potent than these other things. Actually, after we talked, let me see if I looked this up. There was here. You can read about this. I'll put this is, someone actually posted this on on the Heffter website. So if people want to read up about this, you can go to the Heffter.org and look at news, and there's an article post there.
I'll put a link to that in the show notes of this episode. I've heard this criticism before, actually.
Yeah,
this potential
but
problem.
I'm not saying that we know this is the case. I know a lot of people are microdosing, and I don't think we can say right now that it is happening, that it's harmful. I'm just saying this is a cautionary note, essentially. So
how do you feel about the microdosing, like the whole microdosing movement? I know that when you were coming in and helping to make the modern psychedelic scene, there was this focus on actually high doses and to radically transform your view of the world, to radically transform you. How do you feel about the psychedelics becoming this agent by which we become more creatively capitalistic, microdose LSD so that you can produce better apps, so you can make more money in the capitalistic machine for the Google enterprise? Like, how do you feel about psychedelics becoming agents of optimizing ourselves inside of a dysfunctional system rather than agents of true transformation?
Wow. Well, well, I don't think that's the only reason people microdose. I think
for sure
many people, some people, but yeah, there is this it is popular in the tech community, and this claim is made that it helps boost creativity and all that. And, I don't know how I feel about it. I mean, we've always co-opted the sacred. I mean, can you name a tradition that hasn't been commercialized? I
would only know about most of them because of the commercialization. So
this is what we do. I mean, look at the Catholic Church and their indulgences. I mean, you talk about ayahuasca commercialism. They have nothing over institutions, religious institutions. And so, this is just another aspect of that. But I used to say, and I kind of still agree with it, that microdosing was for people who were too chicken to actually have a psychedelic experience. And they could pretend that they're sort of dabbling in this, but that's all it is. They're dabbling in it. I mean, if you're going to have a psychedelic experience, take the goddamn drug and take a sufficient dose in a proper set and setting and pay attention. This is not like Adderall or something. I mean, if you want a stimulant, take a stimulant. If you want a psychedelic, take a psychedelic. And if you want to completely ignore anything I'm saying, feel free to do so.
Well, thank you for the permission, Dennis. I might not, but I appreciate knowing that I could ignore you if I choose.
I'm not here to tell people what to do. I'm here to tell you what I think is the right thing to do. So that's different.
Well, that goes into this next question here, and I'll just read it.
Okay.
What is the opinion of the psychedelic community being tasked by the mushrooms to set up a safe space for others to trip? I think the really relevant questions here are where to begin if one's journey is in that direction. I think he's asking about how to help people have safe mushroom experiences. What should one be asking themselves about the responsibility of leading others to these other dimensions?
Well, for one thing, I think, if you look at ayahuasca as a model, these shaman go through a period of training. They go through, do a dieta or whatever the traditional practice is. I mean, and there are many people, I mean, I think this is where it goes off track, is there are many people who go to South America, they go to a place, they do 3 or 4 sessions, and the next thing they know, they're hanging out their shingle, and they're like, okay, now I'm a shaman. It's not quite so easy. It actually does take discipline to learn how to use these things on yourself and then how to give them to others in a way that, maximizes the benefit and minimizes any harm. It's, So I think if people feel this calling to give mushrooms or give ayahuasca or give these medicines to other people, with them in the role of being a shaman or a healer or a facilitator or a therapist, however you want to characterize that, I think it's important that you know the territory, essentially, that either you apprentice yourself to someone that can teach you, or if you want to, you can approach it individually, and you could just say to yourself, well, ayahuasca is the teacher, but I can do it on my own, and I know people that have become very good ayahuasqueros without any human apprentice. But I think it's important to kind of put yourself through the process. It's not a shortcut to anything. Learning to use these medicines therapeutically is a tough road, and you have to learn how to do it. And you have to, for one thing, you have to take the medicine a lot so that you understand its properties. I've been taking ayahuasca for probably well over 35 years now. Yet I've never felt the calling to give it to people. I organize the retreats. I do the logistics and all that. I do not feel qualified to pour it and hand it to somebody in my retreat. And I feel like I don't know enough. I've only been in this game for 35 years. I have not yet learned enough, to feel confident. And also I think you do have to feel, you have to feel, a calling to do it, a desire to help people in that way. And I don't really feel that, I'm glad to see that it works. My role in talking about these things is I'm a teacher. I'm a talker. I'm a pretty good teacher, a pretty good talker, and I can talk about it in that way. Nowhere near as good as Terence was, but I can still get my message out, and that's what I can do. I can see myself as a scientist and an educator, but not so much a practitioner. But I think if people are really called to it, they should be encouraged to do it. But they should proceed slowly and carefully, and always listen to the medicine. There are many practitioners, who you can tell by the way they are when they're, that they're not listening to the medicine. It's not a vehicle for it's not really a vehicle for celebrity or, adulation of the person. If you take a lot of ayahuasca and can't be humble, I think you're not listening to the medicine. If you're listening to the medicine, you realize none of us has any excuse for arrogance here.
Thank you.
And I think that's mainly one of the big lessons from ayahuasca.
So, Dennis, I know that you have a time limit. Do you have time for 2 more questions?
Well, let's see how it goes.
So the first one might be easy, or hopefully it is, and it has to do with what you were just saying about ayahuasca. And it's the patron would like to hear about your current psychedelic usage regimen, specifically which psychedelics, how often, and what are you still learning after all these years of use?
Okay, well, that's a multi-part question. I tend to use ayahuasca more than mushrooms now, just because of the circumstances that I use it under since I do these retreats. I still use mushrooms. I still respect mushrooms a lot, and ayahuasca, I am not someone who says that mushrooms are easy and ayahuasca is hard. I think mushrooms can be very challenging, at high doses. So those are my 2 plant teachers primarily, mushrooms and ayahuasca. I take mushrooms maybe twice a year and ayahuasca anywhere from, probably about 10 times a year, just because I'm doing retreats and opportunities come up. But I don't say one is better than the other. I think they're different. I think they're complementary. So that's my personal relationship to these things. What was the rest of the question?
It was like, what psychedelics are you using, how often, and what are you still learning after all these years of usage, which is a really big question.
Yeah, what I'm still learning, I mean, people say, well, why are you still taking it? Haven't you learned everything?
Didn't you get the message? Hang up the phone, Dennis.
No, but that's the thing. I don't believe in hanging up the phone because it's not an answering machine. That's the thing. I totally disagree with that notion. I think that, these are teachers. And so you don't walk away from your teacher. You don't tell your teacher, well, you've taught me everything you have to teach. There's nothing else to learn here. We'll see you later. I think that's very disrespectful because, when I take ayahuasca, I mean, it never fails to remind me how little I know, and it will emphasize that. Don't forget how little you know. Or sometimes it will say it in a more strident way. It will say, you don't know shit. This is a good thing to remember. We actually don't know shit. And so there's always the opportunity to learn new stuff. And I think that's one of the good things that that's one of the long-term lessons. I think it's a reminder, and it's good to go back for that reminder. The reminder that, number one, we really don't know very much, which means there's still a lot to learn. And if you're curious and you like to learn and you're trying to understand, then ayahuasca is a good way to remind yourself that you live in a marvelous reality and we understand almost nothing about it. Science notwithstanding. I mean, science tends to get arrogant about what it knows because it doesn't remind itself often about the vast amount that it does not know. And so it gets distorted in that way. So what do I still learn from taking ayahuasca? Well, it's like, I can't put my finger on it exactly, but there's always something that comes up. I keep doing it because I like it. Mm-hmm. I feel that it's useful. I mean, people say, well, someone may say, well, you've been eating chocolate for 50 years. When are you going to stop? Why would I stop?
Yeah, I hear you, man. Yeah,
I happen to like chocolate.
Yeah. Just to clarify, you had mentioned like ayahuasca can keep showing things to learn from things. Would you say the same about other psychedelics as well, such as psilocybin or LSD?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So
there's a vast amount of undiscovered things. It's really, the limitation is not with the medicine, the limitation is with you. How much do you have stomach for? How much can you stick with it and pay attention? It always seems to come up with something new, something surprising, some insight or whatever. I've never really reached a place where that's stopped. And people say, well, what have you learned? What is the great lesson? And then I have to say, well, it's, you're going to be disappointed because the great lesson is you don't know shit. That's the lesson.
This is something, reminds me of something Graham St. John wrote in his book, Mystery Schools in Hyperspace. And I think it was when he was talking about Terence, he had mentioned something about encountering the mystery. And of course, you're never going to figure it out because the very nature of the mystery is that it's mysterious.
It's a mystery.
Yeah.
Yes. But it's reassuring in a way to know that, well, there is a mystery and there's actually more than meets the eye when it comes to existence. When it comes to our existential situation, I would far rather believe in that than believe that, the universe is without meaning. And I think some of Terence's existential crisis back in the day was, with some of his trips, he was confronted with the possibility that it really is without meaning. And that was very disturbing to him.
That's actually something that I've gone through and was very disturbing for me too, actually.
Yeah, so you can see how he might want to step away from that. I have never been cursed with that, really. I mean, I've always been lucky in the sense that I keep a perspective, I guess, on reality, that it's a pretty amazing endeavor. And if we think how improbable it is for us to even be here is, close to some kind of miraculous thing. So that keeps me going.
Beautiful.
It's a useful delusion. Let's call it that.
Yeah, right. We talked about that earlier. Well, I'm happy to be participating in this highly hallucinogenic serotonin trip with you. I do have one final question, Dennis, and I know that you had just said, there's no one great lesson that you're learning or something. But my final question is, if you were to die tomorrow, and obviously we both hope that you don't, but if you were to die tomorrow, what piece of hard-earned advice would you offer to those of us who see psychedelics as a part of our life path as well?
Stay humble, and listen to the medicine. Listen to the medicine that will help you stay humble. If you're doing it in the right spirit. Don't take yourself too seriously. Stay curious. That's a big thing. Stay engaged. Have fun. Keep your sense of humor. If life is a cosmic giggle, then don't forget to laugh. I think that's one of the things that psychedelics remind us to do. We tend to take ourselves much too seriously, and it's not healthy.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dennis. Just to sign us off, maybe you could tell us about the retreats you're running in Peru, where people can get a copy of The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, and about something that's called, pardon if I got this wrong, the ESPD 50?
Yes, yeah, okay, sure. Shameless self-promotion on all fronts. Just a sec. I can't take that. Okay.
Can you make it not do the tweeting sound?
Well, it's gonna stop.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay. I definitely couldn't hear you while that was happening.
Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. So ESPD50.com. People can look at ESPD50.com. This is a conference that I organized in earlier this year, and it stands for Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. And if they visit that site, you can see this actually commemorates a conference by the same name that was held 50 years ago in San Francisco in 1967. And it was sponsored by the U.S. government, and it was the first and only conference like that ever held. The government was wanting to do this every 10 years or so, but the war on drugs came along and they got embarrassed that they ever did this. But I felt I wanted to do a commemorative symposium, which I did, and turned out to be the 50th anniversary. So we're now publishing the proceedings of that as a match set with the original one and the proceedings from this one, so people can look on that website and order the book if they're so inclined. They can also get the all the videos. Let me put the videos up here. Link to the videos.
Well, I can make sure to follow up with you about that later.
All right.
And
All right.
they'll be in the show notes to this episode.
Okay, good. I'll give you a link. That's the most complicated one. The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, you can order from Amazon, or you can order it from my website, which has got the same name, brotherhoodofthescreamingabyss.com. And if you want a signed copy, you can order it there, and I'll send you a signed copy. And then the retreats I do in South America right now are called. I'll give you the address here. SymbioLifeSciences.com/event. They're called Journey of the Soul, and from that link you can find out how to sign up. We have two happening in January, and usually we do them in January and August. So we've got two coming up in January, one of which is full, but the other one is still got spaces. So if people are interested, they can find out more there.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dennis, for your double time today, and and again for everything that you've done for not only my generation of psychonauts, but the ones that will follow me. You really help lay an incredible foundation, and so thank you very much, Dennis.
Well, thank you, James. It's been a pleasure. I'm sorry we had to break this up into a couple segments, but this is my life. It's parsed out in 15-minute chunks.
Well, thanks for offering us several of those today.
Yeah. Very good.
Okay.
Let me know when it's up, and I can post it.
I will do. Okay. Take care, Dennis.
All right. You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, that does it for us here at Adventures Through the Mind for this episode. Thank you for listening. Please take a moment to check out more of Dennis's work. You can find links to everything he mentioned at the end of the show there at jameswjesso.com. That website is also where you will find a catalog of the larger body of my own work, which includes writing, lectures, and other videos. This podcast is brought to you by the loving support of my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are in the upper corner on YouTube and written in the description to this episode. Thank you so much for helping nourish this show to move forward and for me to continue to invest full time in this passion I have for psychedelic culture, for language, and for inspiring people. If you, the listener, are not yet a patron but would like to support the show, please head to patreon.com/JamesWJesso to take a look at what kind of perks you get by becoming a part of this community. You could also leave a one-time donation through PayPal or through a small collection of major cryptocurrencies. Links to do so are in the description to this episode. Thank you for offering me your time and attention to listening to this podcast all the way to the end. I will see you on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Take care.